Get her off the stage. She's blind, she'll ruin the Steinway. That's all it took for the world to nearly miss a miracle. But she didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just played, and the room forgot how to breathe. Elena Grace didn't come from a place of privilege. She was born blind and raised in a revolving door of foster homes scattered across Louisiana, each one a little more temporary than the last. There were no framed baby pictures, no bedtime stories, no piano lessons. But what she lacked in structure, she made up for in instinct. By the time she was 9, she could identify the exact pitch of a truck horn 2 blocks away, or trace the outline of a melody just by the way rain hit a metal roof. Music didn't just speak to her. It guided her through a world she couldn't see. She arrived at Ridgewater Academy at 13, not as a student, not even as an applicant, but as a silent observer. The school didn't openly admit students with disabilities, but it had recently launched an inclusivity pilot program to attract donor attention. Elena, with no money, no parents, and no last name anyone recognized, was offered a pass to experience the environment. What that meant in practice, she was allowed to sit in on classes but not participate, allowed to walk the practice halls, but not touch the instruments. The faculty spoke of access. The staff enforced barriers. Still, Elena came every day. She sat quietly outside lecture rooms with her white cane across her lap, listening, always listening. She memorized fugues from muffled recordings. She traced arpeggios mid-air with her fingertips. She sat cross-legged outside the main rehearsal studio, head tilted toward the floor, feeling the rumble of chords through the wood as prodigies practiced Chopin, Ravel, and Debussy upstairs. The other students barely noticed her. Most were children of symphony directors, recording artists, and political donors. They wore bespoke uniforms and traveled with private tutors. Elena, by contrast, had 1 pair of shoes, a satchel of braille pages, and a second-hand metronome that ticked 2 seconds too slow. And yet, no matter how invisible she became, she was always listening, absorbing, mimicking, internalizing music in a way none of them could understand. She might have remained a shadow at Ridgewater if it weren't for Professor Harold Whitaker. He taught counterpoint and piano theory to advanced students and was known for his sharp critiques and sharper suits. But one evening, while packing up after class, he noticed something strange. A girl sitting motionless just outside the glass door, her hands poised in the air, fingers twitching ever so slightly in rhythm with the lesson he'd just finished. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. But then it happened again, and again. Every week, same time, same place. Like clockwork. Curious, he approached her one day. "Were you following the lecture?" he asked. Elena turned her head. "Trying to," she replied softly. "I'm sorry, if I wasn't supposed to." He paused, watching her small hands hover in space. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Be precise." From that day on, everything changed. Quietly, of course. When the rest of the class left for the day, Whitaker stayed. He didn't teach her with books or keys. He described music in shapes and seasons. He pressed her fingers into different kinds of wood to explain texture. He tapped syncopations onto her knuckles and hummed intervals into her left ear, while she repeated them with near-perfect clarity. She had no formal training. She didn't need it. She had translation. But talent, especially raw talent, rarely finds easy ground in elite places. When the Young Virtuoso Showcase was announced, a prestigious Ridgewater tradition where hand-picked students performed for donors and dignitaries, Elena's name wasn't on the list. Not even close. Professor Whitaker entered her himself. He didn't ask for permission. He simply listed her as guest performer, special category, and submitted a personal recommendation so impassioned it bordered on rebellion. Technically, they allowed her to audition, but her time slot was 7:45 a.m., before most faculty even arrived. The piano assigned to her was a slightly out-of-tune upright shoved into the corner of the East Hall, nowhere near the main stage. There was no audience, no introduction, just one judge, sipping lukewarm coffee and glancing at his phone. Elena sat still for a full minute before playing. No warm-up, no talk, just fingers to keys and silence. Then, like a breath drawn in the dark, she began. Rachmaninoff's prelude in G minor spilled from her hands with the kind of aching, impossible beauty that felt more like memory than performance. It wasn't flawless, but it was alive. And when she finished, the judge nodded once, jotted something in his notepad, and left without a word. She never received a call back. But what she didn't know, what no one told her, was that the janitor who swept that wing every morning had paused outside the door. He'd heard it all. And later that night, with trembling fingers, he uploaded a video he had quietly taken from the corner under the title, "Blind Girl Plays Rachmaninoff by Heart, Rejected by Conservatory." At first, it got maybe 50 views, then 500, then 50,000. By the end of the week, it had been reposted by a classical music blog in Berlin, a music therapist in Argentina, and a street violinist in Brooklyn. The comments poured in. She plays like she's remembering a life I forgot I lived. That wasn't a recital, that was a confession. The world had begun to listen, but Ridgewater still hadn't. The email arrived in the middle of the night, without fanfare, without explanation. It was marked with a golden emblem and titled simply, "Invitation to Perform, Global Gala of Sound Unity, Vienna." Elena thought it was a mistake. She had no manager, no contact information listed publicly. She didn't even own a working phone. But there it was, an official request for her to open the gala's 20th anniversary performance. A celebration broadcast across 60 countries. Theme: breaking barriers in sound. At first she thought it was a prank, but Professor Whitaker's voice cracked when he read it aloud the next morning. He printed it twice, just to make sure. "You're not a shadow anymore," he whispered. "They're asking for you. But not everyone celebrated. When Victor Lacroix, the gala's featured artist and headline performer, heard the news, he didn't blink, didn't laugh. He simply placed his wine glass on the table and said, "She'll compromise the integrity of the program." The words came smooth, calculated, like a scalpel. "She's untrained, unpolished, blind." He paused. "It's a political stunt." He said this to Gérard Marot, the director of the gala, an elderly Frenchman who had built a lifetime reputation on discovering overlooked talent. Gérard didn't flinch. "Victor," he said, voice tinged with steel, "perhaps you've forgotten what truth sounds like." Victor leaned back, his eyes cold. "This isn't a talent show." "No," Gerard replied. "It's a reckoning." Meanwhile, across the ocean, Elena stood barefoot on the marble floors of her Vienna hotel suite. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't call home, because there was no one to call. She just listened. To the wind brushing the window, to the occasional creak of floorboards above her, to the distant clink of plates from room service trays being collected. The world was tuning in, preparing to watch her, but Elena wasn't preparing to perform. She was preparing to feel. She hadn't touched a piano since that day in the East Hall. Something inside her had shifted. The keys had always been her refuge, her place to escape the noise. But now the world wanted to hear her not as a curiosity, but as truth. And that weight felt heavier than any critique. Professor Whitaker flew with her, though the school tried to replace him with a PR manager. "I've taught for 32 years, he told the head of conservatory administration, "but she taught me how to listen." He stayed by her side in silence, never pushing, never rehearsing, just waiting. The day before the gala, Elena was invited to the rehearsal hall. She entered alone. A technician showed her to the Steinway, sleek, black, untouched, the same kind of piano she had never been allowed to touch at Ridgewater. The room emptied, the lights dimmed. She placed her fingers gently on the edge of the bench. She sat and waited. No one gave her a cue. No one dared speak. She inhaled, not a breath, but a choice. Then she played. What came wasn't a piece from any known sonata or composer. It was hers. Raw, unscored, untamed. A single note, then a ripple, then a chord that lingered like memory. Her right hand danced in fractured triplets, her left echoed like grief. Those present, the tech crew, an usher eating a sandwich, even the man adjusting the lighting rig, stood frozen. In the shadows, Victor LaCroix watched through a crack in the door. His brow furrowed, his hands clenched. He wasn't angry. He was afraid. Because she wasn't following any sheet. Not muscle memory, not repetition. She was conjuring something from nothing, creating as she felt. And it was honest. He hadn't played honest in decades. When she stopped, she didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply stood, nodded, and walked away. One technician captured 47 seconds of audio on his phone. By morning, it had been shared 2.6 million times. The blind girl who doesn't read music. She played a room into silence. Rachmaninoff reincarnated? No. Grace begins. Victor requested to change the performance order. He no longer wanted to follow Elena. He wanted to open instead. The request was denied. Backstage, the morning of the gala, Elena sat in stillness. The world buzzed beyond the curtain. Diplomats, philanthropists, critics, waiting, shifting, expecting. Whitaker sat beside her, holding her white cane. "Are you afraid?" he whispered. "No," she said. "I've already played the hardest song. This one is just truth." When the announcer's voice echoed, "Please welcome to the stage, Miss Elena Grace," the audience turned their heads, confused. Most had never heard of her. Some flipped through their programs, others murmured. A few leaned forward. But as soon as she appeared, all of that dissolved. She wasn't dressed in a gown. She wasn't styled or manicured. She walked barefoot, one hand on Whitaker's arm, the other loosely gripping her cane. Her steps were slow, unafraid, deliberate. When she reached the Steinway, she paused, then sat, and the silence that followed became sacred. She didn't play right away. Her fingers hovered, then fell still. She let the silence bloom until it bent around her like fabric. Then she began. The music didn't sound like anything they knew. It was fragile at first, single notes like questions. Her right hand played curiosity, her left, the ache of distance. It swelled, dipped, shuddered, and rose. Some in the crowd began to cry without knowing why. Halfway through, Elena's left hand dropped away. With her right, she played a melody in E major. Simple, familiar, but different. The repetition felt like a lullaby remembered by heart. And then came a shift. One note bent slightly downward, one skipped altogether. And every mother in the room knew. It was a lullaby, her mother's lullaby. A girl who couldn't remember her mother's voice had given it back to the world. When the final chord faded, she didn't move, didn't bow, didn't smile. She just breathed, and the audience erupted. Applause like thunder, cheering that split the air. Some stood, some wept. One critic collapsed into their chair, shaking. Cameras tried to capture it, microphones tried to record it, but it wasn't a performance. It was a reminder of what art was supposed to be. Backstage, Victor watched the monitor. His hands trembled. "He won't remember me tonight," he whispered. "They'll remember her." And he was right. When the lights faded and the echoes of applause finally thinned into breathless silence, Elena Grace stood slowly, not to bask in recognition, but to return to the shadows where she had always felt most herself. She didn't wait backstage. She didn't linger near the press corridor or join the green room reception. She stepped quietly out through a side door of the Grand Harmonique Hall and disappeared into the cool Vienna air, the weight of her cane tapping rhythm against cobblestone as if composing her next measure with each step. The world, however, would not let her vanish. Within hours, every major outlet had published headlines. Blind teen stuns gala. No sheet music, no sight, just sound. Race begins. Elena Grace rewrites music history. And one, simply, the note that stopped time. Clips of her performance flooded the internet, translated into more than 20 languages. Cellists wept on live streams. Violinists posted reaction videos. A retired conductor in Japan called it the most honest performance since Richter. Within 48 hours, her name was the top search in 23 countries. And yet, Elena had no idea. She was already gone. Back in her hotel, she sat cross-legged on the floor with Professor Whitaker, a teacup cooling between them, her fingers idly tracing the cracks in the marble tile. "Was it enough?" she asked softly. Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't just play music," he said. "You changed its shape." She tilted her head, hearing the weight in his voice but not quite understanding. "But I didn't finish the story." He smiled. "No, because now the world will be begging for the rest." At that moment, a knock came at the door. Not harsh, not urgent, just breathless. Whitaker rose to answer, and in stepped a man in a charcoal gray coat, snow still clinging to his sleeves. "Elena Grace?" he asked, his voice catching. She turned toward him slightly. "My name is Anthony Luo," he said. "I'm with Deutsche Harmonia Records. We just saw your performance. And I don't have the words, but we want to talk. Global tour, first album, studio access, anything you need." Elena didn't respond right away. She listened first. To his breath, quick and genuine, to the nervous beat in his chest. Honest. She twisted the silk tassel on her cane and finally asked, "Do you know what the word prelude means?" Anthony blinked. "It's the beginning, right?" She nodded. "An introduction to something bigger. Something that hasn't happened yet." She gestured faintly toward the concert hall, where the final applause was still echoing in the bones of the building. Tonight wasn't the story. It was just the prelude. The next morning, more offers poured in. From labels, festivals, ministries of culture, and royal patrons. Some offered blank checks, others entire stages named in her honor. Elena answered none of them. Instead, she and Whitaker boarded a quiet train to Salzburg and rented a small cottage near the woods. She requested no screens, no soundproofing, just windows that opened wide enough for the wind to enter. There, she wrote again, but it wasn't stormy or tortured. It began with a whisper, a single three-note phrase repeated with slight variation. She built it gently, letting it breathe. And when she finally played it for Whitaker, he closed his eyes halfway through and turned his face slightly away. Not to hide tears, but to honor the moment. "You've written a bridge," he whispered. She looked confused. "A bridge between who you were and who you've become." She'd titled the piece Sightlines. It debuted not in a stadium or symphony hall, but in a modest chamber space in Paris, unannounced, unstreamed. Just 100 people sat in folding chairs and listened. And those lucky enough to be there described it as the sound of finding a path in the dark and realizing you'd known the way all along. Weeks later, a call came to the Salzburg cottage, a journalist from the Artisan Prize Foundation. Elena had been nominated, the youngest in history, the first blind nominee, the first with no formal graduation, no certifications. Whitaker handed her the phone. "Elena Grace, are you aware you've just been nominated for the highest international honor in music?" She sat quietly, the sun hitting her face through the lace curtains. "I've never competed," she said gently. "Not really." "It's not a competition," the caller replied. "It's recognition." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she ran her hand over her Braille notebook, where half-finished melodies curled like vines. Then she whispered, "Then let the music speak. That's all I've ever wanted." As news of the nomination spread, the world responded, not just with celebration, but transformation. In Detroit, children in underserved schools were handed keyboards instead of tablets. In Buenos Aires, a program launched for tactile musical learning. In South Korea, blind composers were invited to national competitions for the first time. One conservatory declared all auditions henceforth would be done blind, literally and figuratively. They called it the Grace Effect. But Elena didn't post, didn't film, didn't comment. She simply played. One morning, in a quiet village library near Salzburg, she was found playing an upright piano older than her, its keys yellowed and uneven. A child sat nearby with noise-canceling headphones, watching her fingers. She invited him to sit beside her. He tapped a note, then another, and by the end of the afternoon, they had written a 4-bar melody that would go on to be featured in a campaign for youth mental health across Europe. A local teacher blogged about it. No photo, just words. Elena. She never told us who she was, but she left behind music that made the snow feel warmer. Murals began to appear, not of her face, but of her hands, outstretched, not posed, but in motion. Invisible notes blooming beneath them. Some called her a genius. Others called her a ghost. But those who truly listened called her what she really was, a bridge. Between silence and sound, between seen and unseen, between the broken and the becoming. And in quiet corners of the world, when children hum to themselves in the dark, or an old man taps a rhythm against his mug, or someone feels their heart rise for reasons they can't explain, they don't say her name out loud. They just whisper it softly. Elena. Months passed. Invitations kept coming. Elena declined them all, quietly, gracefully, without drama or disdain. It wasn't about fame or pride or fear. It was about something deeper. She didn't want to play songs she hadn't lived yet, didn't want to stand on stages that silenced more than they amplified. So instead of traveling city to city for applause, she began traveling village to village for presence. In a small mountain town outside Geneva, Elena was found sitting in the back of a bakery, playing a melody on a wooden recorder gifted to her by a child in Peru. Customers didn't recognize her. They just stopped, held their breath, and listened as flower-dusted air turned sacred. A woman cried into her apron and whispered, "That sound. It feels like I'm being remembered." In a clinic for trauma survivors in Lisbon, she taught a group of teenagers how to feel rhythm through touch, lining metal bowls with sand, striking gently, mapping vibration with their feet. One boy who hadn't spoken in 6 months tapped a sequence into her palm. She smiled, repeated it back. He laughed. And the nurse standing by the door sobbed because it was the first time he'd laughed in years. She never took credit, never asked for photos, but every time she left, someone began to believe again. Back at Ridgewater Academy, the same conservatory that once refused to let her audition on the concert Steinway, things were changing. Not because of protests, not because of pressure, but because of her echo. A new wing was built, glass walls, full accessibility, sound-sensitive floors. It was named the Grace Wing for sonic exploration. The only inscription at its entrance read, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything waiting to be heard." Victor LaCroix, once the golden god of Ridgewater, had disappeared from the public eye. No tours, no albums, no commentary. But in an obscure interview, buried in a music blog, he said one thing: "I thought perfection was the goal. Then she showed me that presence was enough." One afternoon, Elena received a letter, written in Braille, pressed into heavy parchment. It was from a teenage girl named Luma, blind since birth and diagnosed with auditory hypersensitivity. "Music always hurt me," it read. "Too loud, too sharp. I thought it wasn't meant for me. Then I heard about you." Enclosed was a 4-note melody Luma had composed on a toy keyboard. "It's not much," the letter ended, "but it's the first sound that didn't scare me." Elena packed her recorder and went. She didn't knock when she arrived. She sat on the steps of Luma's building and began to play, not toward the street, but inward, into the cracks between bricks, into the silence where a girl sat curled, hands over ears. Within minutes, Luma opened the door. No one told her to. She just followed the sound. She sat beside Elena and touched the flute. Then smiled. Then wept. They played together until dusk. Years later, Luma would become a sound artist known for designing immersive gardens of vibration and light. When asked what first made her believe she could belong in music, she always answered the same. "She didn't show me how to play. She showed me that music already loved me. I just had to let it." Elena never returned to the spotlight, not in the way the world hoped. She never held a press conference, never accepted a talk show invitation, never signed her name to a viral campaign. Yet somehow, her influence only deepened, not through visibility, but through resonance. Through stories passed from hand to hand, like folded music sheets tucked inside coat pockets, or whispered memories at the end of hallways. No announcements, no tour dates, only a presence that traveled faster than headlines. In Montreal, a street violinist named Camille cited her as the reason he finally recorded his first album, after 20 years of playing anonymously in the metro. "I thought music needed to be loud to matter," he told a crowd at the World Music Symposium. "But she showed me you could whisper and still move mountains." In Johannesburg, a girl built a listening dome made of broken wind chimes and rain pipes. She called it a house for forgotten sound. When asked if she'd ever met Elena, she shook her head and replied, "No one meets her. You just feel her." In the depths of the Amazon, an elder began teaching orphans rhythm, using vines stretched across hollowed logs. The children named it the Grace Pulse. And still Elena traveled, not to perform, but to witness, to guide. She would appear in the most unexpected places. A hospital in Buenos Aires, humming to a newborn who wouldn't stop crying. A temple in Kyoto, using the drip of water and the creak of wooden floors as instruments in a midnight symphony. A subway tunnel in New York, leaving behind a single note etched in chalk: "Play this and pass it on." She was never followed by cameras, never surrounded by agents. But people knew when she'd been somewhere. Because something always changed. A community choir would form. A broken piano would get tuned. A child who had stopped speaking would suddenly start humming. They called it the grace shift. In the music halls that once overlooked her, new mottos appeared, not printed but lived. Feel before you play. Presence over perfection. If they can't hear you yet, play anyway. And back at Ridgewater Academy, in the heart of the Grace Wing, a grand piano now sat. Not behind a velvet rope, but in the center of an open room, surrounded by empty chairs. Visitors weren't asked to watch. They were invited to join. The plaque behind the keys bore her final words. If you can hear it, it already belongs to you. One day, years later, a young student named Nora Blind from birth stepped into that space, holding her mother's hand. She had never touched a piano, never believed she could. But she'd heard a story about a girl who once listened through walls and turned silence into song. Nora approached the keys slowly. She trembled, then played a single note. The sound didn't come just from the piano. It came from everyone who heard her. It came from within. And though Nora would never know it, she had begun her own story that day. Because that's what Elena Grace left the world. Not just a legacy, not just compositions, but permission. Permission to play without apology, and to hear without judgment, to create without fear, to be silent and still be heard. And far away, in a canyon where the wind moved like breath between stones, if you listened closely, you might hear it. Not a voice, not a song, but a presence, as if someone once sat there, played, and left behind a silence that sings. That's where she is now. Not gone, just everywhere we choose to listen.